Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with the Anti-Fake News Act. The government has retabled a bill to repeal the Anti-Fake News Act 2018 in Dewan Rakyat today. So this is after the first attempt to do so was rejected by Dewan Negara last September. So now Pakatan has another go at getting rid of this bill.
Yeah, so Melissa, it's an opportunity for us to understand how government works. In this instance, we learn again, perhaps for the first time, the way in which the Senate or the upper house has powers, but they only have powers to delay a bill. So now they've delayed the bill by a year, which means that after their deliberations and after they voted, even if they choose to now reject it, it still goes through, right?
Yeah.
So it goes through for royal assent. And that's how the government and the structures that we have operate.
Well, you know, earlier this month, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad said that the Anti-Fake News Act may be amended instead of repealed. And that raised all kinds of red flags for me because, you know, this is not a good law. I mean, this law has very vague definitions of what fake news is. In other words, it says news, information, data and reports which are wholly or partly false. I mean, that can be essentially anything. So I'm hoping to see this bill thrown out altogether without any amendments to it, and hopefully we'll be able to see that. However, we have had comments coming out from the Multimedia and Communications Ministry saying that there could be a formation of a parliamentary select committee in terms of looking at the misuse of social media.
Okay, so there is a genuine problem, and the question is, what is the solution? Is the solution going to come in the form of laws, legislation, police powers, or is it going to be through education and greater understanding, media literacy? I think for myself, and I imagine for you too, Melissa, what we don't want is an increase in censorship. We don't want the enabling of invasive forms of surveillance, and we certainly want to protect our privacy, whatever the solution we finally come up with.
You know, Sharaad, I don't necessarily agree with you that there is a problem. I think the problem is that we cannot define what the problem is. I mean, the understanding of what fake news is, and I use, you know, inverted commas because I don't quite like that term. I think that term is problematic. It's not quite false information, but rather in the Malaysian context, it seems to be more racially charged information. It's not about direct lies that can be fact-checked, but rather, you know, content that is used for emotional impact, less about false information. And I think the issue really is organized social media manipulation. And I think that is what we should be looking at. This is exactly what this Parliamentary Select Committee should be looking at. And where I do agree with you is I think that more legislation is not the silver bullet to this issue.
I'm always happy when Melissa agrees with me. Okay,
all right.
What do we have next?
Speaking of the Anti-Fake News Act, Datuk Saleh Said Keruak, the former Sabah UMNO big gun and ex-communications and multimedia minister who once justified the need for fake news legislation, he has applied to join PKR over the weekend. So I believe the latest is that PKR's political bureau said that they were going to weigh in on this and discuss this before making a decision. But I guess at the end of the day, Sharaad, there are no such thing. There's no such thing as permanent enemies or friends in politics.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a problem. It's a problem for the branding of certain organizations, especially if they built up their sort of raison d'etre based on the fight against corrupt politicians or authoritarian politicians and so on and so forth. So this issue, on one hand, is an issue of optics, but it's also an issue of real politics. And we wonder what the PKR position is going to be. Do you think, Melissa, if you were a betting person, what would you place your bets on? Is PKR going to admit Saleh Said Keruak into their ranks?
Oh, you're putting me on a spot there. I don't know whether they will, but I don't think they should, right? So for me, personally, I think that this whole kind of party hopping shouldn't be normalized. We shouldn't be tolerant of this kind of and accepting of party hopping, of changing party allegiances, because should MPs be free to change their political allegiances regardless of their pledges to their previous parties, the promises that they made to the people who elected them, the constituents. I don't think they should.
Well, in many countries, how that is resolved is that
you resign.
Well, no, the voters punish the hopping MP at the next election. So that's an opportunity for voters to vote somebody out. Now, that's what we have in our parliamentary system. But there are certain considerations, and I personally think, to put the question back to myself,
yes, what about you?
Do I think they're going to admit him? I think they will.
Ooh.
And I think because it's gone so far, that if they really didn't want to have him in, they would have killed the story much sooner. But they, I think, are giving themselves some time to lay the groundwork for justification of his entry into the party. Now, the question is what they're going to say. It could be that they will admit him as an ordinary member and then, deny him major positions. But that still leads to the question, how much influence will he have behind the scenes? So he might not have any official positions, but he could still be pulling the strings when it comes to politics in Sabah. And that is something that we need to wait to see.
Well, I'm not quite sure. He did lose with a margin of 4,000 votes in GE14, so he lost his parliamentary seat there. And I wonder whether he still has he wields that kind of influence that you speak of. My question is, what is his agenda? Does he have a comeback agenda? And I'm wondering whether the political bureau of PKR will be weighing all these things, including the optics of this. What will it look like for the party, which has been torn apart by, in-party bickering, whether this is something that they can afford and whether you want to give in to this kind of warlord culture?
Well, Sabah politics is a mystery to me, and I look forward to actually reading more about how things operate and why, in fact, the big man, the warlord, is still an important feature of politics there, and how that impacts, their democratic evolution. Yeah.
All right, on a positive note now, last Saturday, Farah Ann Hadi became the first Malaysian artistic woman gymnast to qualify for the Olympics after some 20 years. Now, she finished 16th out of 20 in the qualifying session of the individual all-round event at the World Championships in Stuttgart in Germany. So Farah Ann is only the third Malaysian gymnast to qualify for the Olympics. This is after Au Liyen in 2000 in Sydney and Shu Wai in 2004 in Athens.
Yeah, and this is a wonderful story. It's sort of a story that brings a smile to your face, because this is a Malaysian who, through sheer hard work and on an international stage where she gains no favors for being who she is or for where she is, purely on merit, purely on her talent and her hard work, that she has succeeded. I mean, she's not at the finish line yet,
but
even
making us proud. Yes,
even then, over a weekend which has been in many ways marred by extreme ethno-nationalist sentiments, this was a wonderful story for which people could genuinely come together across the political spectrum and say, we are Malaysian and proud of it.
Yes, I think there's nothing like sports to bring us together. Well, congratulations to Farah Ann for making us proud and for showing real dignity. You worked hard, you trained daily for years, you persevered despite the cyberbullying and the injuries you sustained, and you qualified to the Olympics on your own merit and talent. After this, we are going to take a closer look at other types of dignity, Sharaad. That's next on Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you this evening. Now, on Sunday, thousands of people turned up for the Congress Maruah Melayu, or the Malay Dignity Congress, at Stadium Melawati in Shah Alam. And to discuss this further, we have on the line with us Ahmad Fuad Rahmat, founder of Project Dialogue and teacher with the School of Media, Languages and Culture at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Fuad, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Now, my first question to you is the name of the Congress itself. Why do you think it was termed a Dignity Congress? I mean, how exactly is Malay dignity under threat?
Well, I think it's trying to capitalize in a general sense that Malays are left behind by the dominant political agenda. And it's trying to foster some sense of, collective solidarity in light of that. So it recognizes that Malays are not necessarily, or Malay issues are not necessarily at the forefront of the reform government, which is, more interested in changing the political culture, changing the laws, so on and so forth. So I think it was trying to ride on that.
Do you think the loss of UMNO, so long a symbol of the Malay agenda, is partly to, the reason why there is so much talk about the Malay agenda, even though, for all intents and purposes, nothing has changed in terms of Malay dominance, not demographic, not politically, and so on and so forth?
Well, that might be how it comes across to maybe the urban liberal radar, but if you just sort of, have a sense of their concerns, which is not necessarily widely represented in the media, you know that there's a change in temperature, right? So there are a couple of, I think, red flags that trigger Malay sort of sentiment, namely one, the scaling down of funding for PPRs. That one has become a racialized issue. I think people see that as affecting a huge Malay populace. The lack of priority towards felder issues, I think, is another kind of gap in the current discourse. And of course, the fact that the government isn't necessarily putting Malay issues front and center. So there's a jarring transition that I think a lot of the Malay voter base isn't quite adapting to. And this Congress is trying to tap into that.
Right. Fuad, this is not the first time within the space of weeks that we've had these types of events and this type of rhetoric. Just a few weekends ago, we had the UMNO Pass Charter at the Perhimpunan Penyatuan Ummah. Now, you talked about a change in the temperature, Fuad. Just to what extent do you think that the anger is organic, that it's coming from grassroots rather than it being manufactured?
I think it's a coming together of two elements here. The first is political opportunism by the mainstream Malay parties seeking a base of sorts. But you can tell too that certain issues have triggered insecurities. I mean, just think of how the Adib inquest was dealt with, and the different ways in which that too was racialized, and that is linked to a longer sort of unresolved issue regards to the Seafield Temple. So I think it doesn't help, too, that we're in an age of social media where insecurities are much easily amplified. So it's a coming together of different aspects that make it, a perfect storm of sorts for that sort of politics, The economy isn't improving as well. So go on,
Fuad, if I could jump into this discussion, there was, of course, the way in which it was constructed. This was not essentially seen as something put together by political parties. It seemed, it was headed by a former academic. A lot of, in fact, institutions, educational institutions were involved. And Dr. Mahathir was kind of invited into this conversation. Is that a lot of wayang, or is that, in fact, how you think this is it? This was a genuine kind of ground-up kind of conversation?
But I don't know if that's the best way to approach it. I mean, who's to say exactly what's genuine? I think the safe bet is to say that there is a need to put Malay issues at the forefront of national discourse again. And this conference did that. It basically put Malay issues on the map again, even though it was haphazard. People got food poisoning, and there's sort of this double speak. On one hand, people insist that it's not racist because, there's no real, firebrand rhetoric. On the other hand, you had Zainal Kling's keynote speech, which is, quoting the Quran and stressing how Malaysia is only for Malays, and so I don't think that's necessarily, the actual content of it is not necessarily the point, nor is it about clear messaging, but the fact that Malays can be galvanized, and they want to have their grievances felt, even though it's not necessarily articulated very clearly. But we're in the game of mob sentiment here.
Would you consider this a success then? Would you consider the Congress a success for its objectives?
Yeah, in a very crude sense, insofar as Malaysia still hasn't really overcome the Malay issue, right? That, even though we have a new government, racial thinking is still something we have to grapple with. In that very minimal way, and the fact that we're kind of concerned about it enough to talk about it, it's already met its objectives. Now, I don't think after this people can say that, we can kind of pretend and kind of deploy a colorblind politics or something. Something has to be said of this. And I think insofar as they're getting a reaction, then they've met an objective, a significant one.
Right. Fuad, as you said, Professor Zainal Keling kind of set the tone with his speech that, the social contract, if it was not adhered to, he says he defined it, could be broken. And he, as you said that, Malaysia is essentially one that is owned by Malays alone. It doesn't seem like Dr. Mahathir followed on that narrative. He didn't build on it. And in fact, he seemed to go off on a completely different tangent, upsetting many groups, including the cleric Abdul Maza and, journalists like Rocky Brew and all that, who've all weighed in saying, they were very unhappy with him. What happened, do you think?
I think he realizes that that's not the crowd that he needs to appease at this point. I think there's a sense in which he obviously is, for most of his career, a Malay nationalist icon. He can't just leave that behind. But he's also got a different political vehicle now. And I think he has enough of a majority to know that he does not have to pander to that sentiment. So I think he used the platform to sort of repeat familiar Mahathir truisms, about how Malays need to buck up and all that, which isn't refreshing. But I think in that sense, he gets to speak to both crowds, right? He criticized Malays enough to show that he's still concerned. But on the other hand, he doesn't really go where they want him to go. So that to me is how I read the maneuvering.
All right, Fuad, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Now we'll be back with more on Consider This in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, let's continue our in-depth look at the Congress Maruah Melayu that happened yesterday, or the Malay Dignity Congress. Joining us on the line now, we have Haris Zwan, Junior Research Fellow with the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies at University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Haris, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, what did you make of the messaging coming out of the Congress and the reception to it?
Hi, thank you for having me. Basically, I think Mahathir just played to the gallery. There's nothing new. What he said by Mahathir yesterday, and I think there is no way we can get a accurate answer to that question, the response by the people in the ground. But however, judging from the comment and response in social media, I think it's safe to say that Malay and non-Malay not impressed by Mahathir's speech yesterday.
Right. It seems like perhaps different communities wanting different things from him. But I just want to draw attention to some of the things that have been reported. Khalid Nordin from UMNO said that, in fact, this entire Congress was a show put up by Dr. Mahathir for his own benefit, for his own political advantage. Whereas, you have somebody like Dr. Muhammad Faiz Naman, who is a part of the Bersatu Supreme Council. He's gone on to say in Sinaharian that he didn't think the Congress was a failure. He came out in some ways to defend Dr. Mahathir at the Congress. It's a really interesting mix of voices. Haris, what's your stand on it? Who put this together, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we must make it clear that university should not be government propaganda tools, especially one that sounds defensive and narrow, such as Malay Dignity, Maruah Melayu. And if you went to the Congress it's not just talking about Malays. He also accusing the others. Then they use the word orang asing, pendatang, this kind of word to refer to the others. And I think this is not the way we should govern our university. Even though university have the right to carry out their own program, they should not be. It should be more intellectual and not loaded with emotions by taking up such team. University have been used as a tool to provide political legitimacy to government propaganda, and I think it's very unfortunate that the same thing occurs under the new government.
You know, there's very interesting remarks made by some observers who were attending the Congress. They said groups like Persatuan Belia Dynamic Barat brought Form 4 students to the Congress. Amana Ikhtiar Malaysia, which is kind of a microcredit organization, it's an agency under the government, they brought thousands of people to the Congress as well. And then because we had UITM making it compulsory for students. So it does seem like there was some sort of coordinated effort, some of them coming from government agencies to support this Congress. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there's nothing new that government agency university been used by government and for the political propaganda. And I believe this is perhaps the manifestation of the government failure to counter the rise of Malay nationalists to the extent that we have to use university and other government agencies to promote the similar teams under the guise of so-called intellectual academic congress. Organizing this such program will only legitimize the ethno-nationalist narrative that Malay are under threat, which give rise to the question who actually threatening the Malays. I think government basically lost the plot and they need to pull up themselves together and come up with a more inclusive narrative.
So could you expand on that? You know, you said the government has lost the plot. Now, I'm just wondering, because, Tun Dr. Mahathir officiated this event, what this says about the Pakatan Harapan coalition. I'm not sure that this would have gone down well with a lot of the coalition parties.
Yeah, of course. First of all, I think Mahathir not just criticizing the Malays, which is what he tried to make people believe, but if you go into details, close examining his speech, you'll see that he not only criticizing Malay, he also not addressing the real issue, the structural issues.
Yeah, we also see, if we look at the video clips that we have now, we see the Education Minister, Mazli Malik, in attendance as well. I mean, is that worrying? I mean, should we be concerned that the Education Minister, is so heavily involved in a Congress that it seems so narrow and, as you put it, not inclusive?
Yes, of course. Mazli Malik should explain himself and how come because for the last few years before being government, he keep criticizing the previous government, using university for political agenda, and now just from his nose, he let this kind of thing happen. And I think we need a more inclusive program by the university.
Okay. Well, on that note, Haris, we asked this question to our previous guest, Fuad Rahmat, as well, and I want to get your thoughts on the organicness of the anxiety that's coming out. Do you think that this is essentially UMNO past anxiety coming together at a conference like this, or is it genuinely more generalized?
Well, of course, there is some real sentiment on the ground. They are not happy with the government, their standard of living. But of course, in Malaysia, we explain and articulate things from racial perspective. But that's the thing. I think we should address this issue first rather than caught up with no nationalist narrative.
Haris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Lots for us to consider this evening. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, and with me, Sharaad Kutin. We will be back same time tomorrow, only on Astro AWANI. Good night.